I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go, sit, but sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it.
These are the home movies of a murderer.
Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
A man who in the 1980s would be uncovered as the most prolific serial killer in British history.
And you ain't seen nothing yet.
A civil servant whose extraordinary behaviour would see him named with cruel irony, the kindly killer.
Batteries had run out, that's why the camera went up the crate. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use it, all you do is point it down and press a button.
But was this murderer of young men driven by nature or nurture? Was the kindly killer born to kill?
Cut.
In the early winter of 1983, we had a problem arise in the Muswell Hill area of London. It was initiated by us receiving a call for a block toilet.
Number 23, Cranley Gardens, had been split into flats and bedsits. The residents had experienced problems with the plumbing for days.
An engineer at the time went to attend the block toilet, cleared the toilet, but did remark to us afterwards that he'd never smelt such a bad smell in an apartment before in his life.
Still, lavatories at the property continued to block.
A plumber was sent around very urgently on Saturday morning, and he looked down in the drains beneath the house, and he saw what he knew was not what should be there.
He observed what he said looked like some butcher's prepared meat and a few bones.
He discovered that what was blocking the toilets was actually human flesh.
On the 9th of February 1983, sitting in my office, minding my own business, and suddenly got a phone call from Peter Slade, who was the early turn uniform inspector, and he asked me if I'd go up to Cranley Gardens. He had a bit of a problem up there, and I just got into the CID car and drove up there. I always remember it was bitterly cold. It had been snowing, and we stood outside this awful house and looked down the pit where the drains were, and he showed me 4 little pieces of flesh, each about 3 inches by half an inch, maybe an inch, and also 3 bones with a knuckle at each end. And my first thought when I saw them was that they were from a human hand. The drains were blocked over halfway up the building, so we knew that the blockage was originating from the very top.
The tenant of the top flat was a 37-year-old executive officer at a nearby job centre, Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was due to return from work at 5:30.
When my 2 colleagues and I walked up to the front door of the place in order to wait for him inside, we had no idea what we were going to find. We knew we had a killer, but we didn't know what he'd done. Nilsen walked in, bang on cue at 5:30, and leading up to that, I had been thinking for 2 or 3 hours about what I was going to face. I knew that for someone to have flushed a dead body down the loo in small pieces, it was going to be somebody a little bit different. When Nilsen came in through that front door, I'd already made a decision to be very light-hearted with him. And I remember saying to him, "Mr. Nilsen," and he said, "Yes, that's me." And I said, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J. I've come about your drains." And a little smile came across his face, and he said, "Well, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" And I said to him, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you all about it." The first thing that caught me was the smell of decomposing flesh. I said to him, "I'm here because your drains were blocked with human remains." And he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just got a little bit closer to him, face to face, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Don't mess me about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he just paused momentarily and he said, "In plastic bags in the other room."
Nilsen was immediately arrested and taken to the station for questioning.
My deputy, Detective Inspector Steve McCusker, sat in the back of the police car and I drove. And I don't know what prompted Steve to do this, but he suddenly said to Nilsen, "Are we talking about one body here or maybe two?" And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 16. Well, I can remember the steering wheel in the car sort of shaking in my hands.
The police hardly could believe their ears because this was all said in a very matter-of-fact voice, very dispassionate. Why dispassionate? Because this is a man without passion. His only passion came when he was in a murderous impulse, when he was overtaken by the other self.
In Nilsen's wardrobes were 2 black plastic bags and several air fresheners. The bags contained dismembered body parts and 2 severed heads. In a tea chest was found another torso, bones and a skull. Under a drawer in the bathroom were legs and a pelvis. It constituted the remains of 3 men. In the garden of an address in Cricklewood, investigators would identify the fragmented remains of at least 8 more.
He told me off the record that if it hadn't have been 15, it would have been 150 if we hadn't caught him when we did, because there was no stopping. The whole thing was just totally bizarre.
Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland. His mother's family had lived there for generations. His father was a visiting Norwegian soldier.
He was one of 3 children, the middle child. He had an older brother, a younger sister. He never really knew his father.
Nilsen, as a child, was a bit of a loner.
He didn't really have friends because everybody thought he was a bit odd. His mother said she could never cuddle him. He didn't have tactile relationships with anyone except his grandfather.
Nilsen's father is absent from the household, and so he had formed a bond with his grandfather. They would walk together, fish together, and so forth.
The boy's grandfather would often be away for weeks at a time, trawling the fishing grounds of the North Sea.
One day, he came home from school, and his mother said to him, "Oh, do you want to see your granddad?" He said, oh, he didn't know he was there even. So he was very pleased about that, and he went into the kitchen, and there on the kitchen table was a long box, and in it was his grandfather. Nobody had prepared him for the fact that he was dead.
Nilsen's grandfather had died at sea, and his corpse had been brought home for burial.
He had this picture in his mind imprinted of seeing his grandfather white as a sheet. And I think that affected him deeply.
Nilsen would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, that this was when Nilsen first began to associate love with death, an inert body.
From that moment, I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that his idea of love and his idea of death fused and became linked, inextricably linked. When his mother said to him, "Your granddad's gone to a better place," he, the little boy, age 6, thought, well, if he's gone to a better place, why didn't he take me with him? He would sometimes even go out into the sea and simulate drowning as a means of being with him.
Aged 15, Nilsen would leave his home behind.
Nilsen would join the army. Specifically, he joined the catering corps, which is, of course, where he'd learn his butchering skills. Skills that were going to be put to use in a different context when he's back in civilian life.
In 1983, the discovery of human flesh blocking the drains at 23 Cranley Gardens had led to the arrest of civil servant Dennis Nilsen. He claimed to have taken the lives of at least 15 young men. Investigators learned that he'd had a lonely childhood, punctuated by the death of a beloved grandfather. At 15 years old, he joined the Army Catering Corps. Early on, the young Nilsen would stand out from his fellow new recruits.
He was quite argumentative in as much as not picking an argument in a nasty sort of way, but if you said that photograph is black and white, you'd know he was saying it was white and black, and so forth. He was quite contrary as a person, really. We used to sit listening to the Beatles, Rolling Stones. We'd read the Parade magazines, which are like girly magazines of the day, and he'd probably be reading broadsheets, and he'd also listen to classical music. I remember there was once a scrap in the barrack room, and I think he scratched and slapped. He didn't thump like the rest of us. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, Nilsen, you're weird."
The teenage Nilsen harbored a secret.
What's interesting about the army experience is that it would have been impossible for Nilsen to have shared the fact that he was gay with any of his colleagues.
Basically, they just didn't accept homosexuals at all. So if somebody was gay, they'd keep very, very quiet about it.
During his time in the army, Nilsen began a lifelong interest in photography.
He maintained it was his hobby, photography, but it was much more important than a hobby. It was self-realization. He used to get his colleagues in the army to pretend that they were corpses, as if they'd been slain in battle, and he would take photographs of that. They thought this was a bit odd, but they went along with it.
Nilsen would spend 11 years in the Armed Forces Catering Corps, rising to the rank of corporal.
I think he was a bit of a bully underneath, but with his rank, you know, once he was in charge of a room sort of thing, I think he tended to bully a bit.
But just before his 27th birthday, Nilsen would reject the familiarity and order of army life and strike out on his own. In 1970s London, he found a thriving gay scene.
He's living in a large urban metropolitan area where clearly there are gay pubs that he would be able to visit for the first time.
People were more friendlier back then. People were very chatty, and life in London was exciting at that time. He wasn't a bad-looking man, and he seemed quite educated, quite good to talk to.
He chooses his words well, fluently, but after a few minutes you'd realize that he's not talking to you or with you, but he's talking to himself, because he doesn't pay attention to anything except what he himself is saying.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic.
Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police.
This is not unusual for these individuals to seek out a profession of authority, whether it's a police officer or some other civil servant type job where they could have control over someone else. This is what is so stimulating to them.
He's living a double life. He's living a life of the police constable, but at the same time, he's also living a double life, talking about being able to express his sexuality. And of course, that inevitably would lead to conflict.
After 11 months, Nilsen tired of the police and quit. He was also becoming disillusioned with the transient nature of the gay scene and began to seek more permanent companionship.
What he was looking for was a relationship, somebody to share his life with.
You didn't go out to find companionship in a club. You just went out to pick up. That was what generally people did. They weren't there for an affair or a relationship. They just wanted a one-night stand.
He got a job with Manpower Services in the heart of the West End. But the opinionated young Scot struggled to bond with anyone.
He's not somebody who's going to make friends very easily. He's not somebody who's going to be the life and soul of the party. He's far too self-centered. He's far too self-obsessed.
But harassed commuter, harassed London tenant being screwed by the Department of Employment, London Transport, big chain stores, supermarkets. Can you, cut there, let me think.
So he's got this quite isolated existence in which he finds it difficult to make friends, in which it's very difficult for him to socialize in any normal way, and that isolation would mean that he would return to his home and lose himself in alcohol. He was a drunk, frankly. I'm not sure he was alcoholic, but he did like to get drunk.
Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party. No.
And he would listen intently to music.
Nilsen was more at ease with machines and objects than he was with people. So music was a way of controlling what was being heard. You can't control a person, you can't control what he's going to say and how he's going to react and how he's going to respond, but you can control the record player.
Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
In 1976, Nilsen meets a young drifter called David Gallishan. Gallishan is unemployed and living in a hostel. And although they're seemingly unsuited, Nilsen seeks out a flat for them both to set up home together.
He's ready, Des.
Yeah, okay, come in a minute. I got to sign on.
Oh yeah, I'm going to sign on today. I'll sign on again.
Where's that bloody dog? It's been chewing my slippers again.
Here it is. Chewing your slippers, so give it.
I'll wring its bloody neck if I catch it again.
Melrose Avenue was a very old kind of building. It had lots of furniture in it that lots of had been bought during the war, really. It was quite old. The carpets weren't very nice, and it was quite a run-down building.
1:10 last night. Son asleep, twink over there, me here. What happens? Crash, bang, what? Have a look, move the counter up there. Have a look at that. Right? Look at the state of that. Whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start, rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old pooch, blood cheek goes up, big row, and it wakes you up as well. Great chunks. Bloody great chunks of masonry. I mean, you could kill somebody. Listen to that.
They had French windows which led into a garden, Nobody from upstairs could get into the garden. Only he had the entrance through the French windows.
You're a big nincompoop. Oi, over here.
Over here?
Over here, stand up.
How long do you think it'd take me to dig the garden?
Don't stand there with your hand on your hip, feel like a big poof.
But Nilsen's overpowering and controlling nature would drive a wedge between the companions.
Find everything.
Oh, come on, where's my bloody tea then?
Got tea? Oh, it is.
David Gallishan walked out on him after about 18 months. And that really hurt Nilsen, I'm sure it did.
He was essentially a lonely man by virtue of the fact that he bored everyone and they all left him.
So the thing he's searching for is companionship, a relationship, and it's the one thing that psychologically, sociologically, he's not set up to be able to do.
You're a great pillock, Twinkle.
And then he used to invite more and more people back, hoping that someone would stay.
He did ask me to move in, but I said, I don't think I can put up with you in the bottle. The bottle comes between us, it's too much of it. You've got to stop that. If you stopped it, you'd be a lovely, decent guy to live with. But he couldn't stop that. He couldn't stop that. He seemed to be very into himself. It was all him, him, him. He never hardly asked anything about me.
Anything good you find in this kitchen is probably attributed to my having purchased it in the first place. Bloody light doesn't even go on. Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near. That's...
The lonely Nilsen increasingly took refuge in his morbid private fantasies.
He used to lie on the floor in front of a mirror and put glue on his lips and make his eyes look bloodshot. And he got satisfaction out of regarding himself in the mirror in that way. Not, I don't think, an emotional satisfaction, but a deep requirement of his nature, which was obviously perverted.
He would make out he'd passed out and would fall to the floor. You know, and you go rushing up to him and he'd just be laying there. But I actually know that he wasn't asleep. He wasn't out. He wasn't passed out. He was awake. And he would stay there and he would stay there and you'd sit down, you could cook a meal, you could watch television, still be there. But I know that he wasn't asleep. You just know. And it would be in this position of a kind of arms outstretched position. I believe he was pretending to be dead.
All the while, Nilsen continued to play the role of the unremarkable civil servant.
He gets up in the morning, he's a civil servant, he goes to work, he comes home at night. He tends his garden, he cooks for himself, he has a dog which he calls Bleep.
Bleep! Come on. Woof, woof, woof. Come on, Bleep, say something.
So there's a sense in which these are the banality, the ordinariness of suburban life.
Ooh, ah. Bloody finger, you great pillock.
But of course, Nilsen doesn't really have a sense of how an ordinary life is actually what most people experience, because Nilsen wants to be extraordinary.
On New Year's Day, 1979, 33-year-old Dennis Nilsen woke up next to a teenager he'd met in a pub the night before. The lonely Manpower Services employee later claimed he couldn't face the thought of the sleeping boy leaving.
There came a moment when the murderous impulse to keep this man, not to let him go, overtook him.
Nilsen took a tie, wrapped it around the boy's neck, and pulled.
He was astonished at his strength At the moment of the murder, he was amazed at how strong he was, because he was not normally a very strong man. Once the murder had occurred and Nilsen had before him a corpse, he then, in a very peculiar fashion, looked after the corpse.
Now, for the first time, Dennis Nilsen had the means to live out his darkest and most secret fantasies.
He would run a bath, he would bathe it, clean it, he would then make it comfortable, he would dry it, put it into the bed, put it into an armchair.
Nilsen lived with the corpse for a week. He then placed the naked body under the floorboards, where it remained for almost 8 months.
If you have this body, you have to find some way to get rid of it, and you certainly don't want it to be identified as quickly as you possibly can.
Nilsen was efficient. He couldn't relate to a person emotionally, but he could relate to a corpse as something that had to be disposed of. It was a problem that had to be solved. That's much easier than dealing with people and their emotions.
Nilsen's garden would provide the solution.
He burned his body in the garden of Melrose Avenue, obliterating him and spreading his ashes to the four winds.
It was not until 2005 that the victim would be identified as 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. His murder would prove to be merely the beginning.
I think the first murder that any serial killer commits is always the revealing murder. He enjoyed doing it, and I think it's that enjoyment that he got from that first murder that propelled him to kill again and again and again.
Well, this is Soho, and the heart of Soho, Old Compton Street. And this is the area that Nilsen used to favour. He'd come out in his spare time to this kind of area and to gay pubs in particular in order to make contact with people. So he had contact with a lot of youngsters who were coming to London thinking the streets were paved with gold and who were probably no fixed abode, may have run away from home, dropouts, that kind of person.
The people that Nilsen went to meet were people he instinctively, with an uncanny knack, recognized as people who were lonely and would be most likely to accept an invitation to go home.
Often there is no record of these people being reported as missing, and therefore he's tackling a particularly vulnerable group that many other serial killers target.
While living at Melrose Avenue, Dennis Nilsen would pick up and strangle to death a further 11 young men.
If you strangle someone, you feel it, you can touch it. You just grab whatever's at hand and pull.
I have always suspected that Nilsen would strangle the people that he really didn't want to go at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, the ones that he wanted to stay, the ones he didn't particularly want to be with, they'd just go at the end of the night.
That may be true to some extent, but I would look at it in a very different way. I would say that he wanted the bodies to be there because it assured him how in control he was of other people. This is what is arousing to an individual like Nilsen, to be in complete control and domination of others.
Nilsen used the bodies of his victims sexually and in other ways. Nilsen wanted to stay close to these bodies, almost as if they were a form of trophy. He wants to express his power, his complete and utter domination of these young men, even after they're dead.
after he killed them, he would sometimes bring them out and put them in a chair and have conversations with them as if they were still alive.
They can watch television with him. He can talk to them.
He even would go so far as to come home from work and find the corpse sitting in the same armchair that he'd left him in that morning and saying to him, guess what happened to me today? So this was a substitute for real human company.
Nilsen is so self-obsessed, so desperate for his opinion to be the only opinion that counts and matters, he finds it easier to relate, to have a conversation with a dead young man who isn't capable of answering back.
He would then keep the corpse for quite a few days until they became unbearable. He would eviscerate them. He would put into the garden the spleen and stuff which might be proved impossible to live with, and then put what was left of the corpse under the floorboards.
An obsessive compulsive personality where somebody is attuned to details and orderliness and so on is very common in prolific serial killers, because that personality trait will help them elude law enforcement. They're aware of forensic evidence, they'll clean things up meticulously, and so on.
Ultimately, the bodies that were serving as Nilsen's companions would become an annoyance to him. They were in the way. He needed to get rid of them for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they'd smell. Also, they were an annoyance to him because he keeps wanting to bring more live young men back to his flat.
I would actually stay there for the night or maybe for the weekend or whatever. All I can say is that the smell from Melrose Avenue, which you put down to dry rot or whatever rising down, I don't know, animal smells. It smelled awful, it really smelled nasty. But nothing other than this really stood out, nothing at all.
With no further room under the floorboards, the decomposing corpses were removed, cut into manageable pieces, and taken into the garden.
In the middle of the night, he would have a huge bonfire in his garden, burning the remains, disguising the smell with rubber tires.
And the local children came and danced around the bonfire because they thought it was all rather fun, having not the faintest idea what was going on, really.
Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men without arousing suspicion. In 1981, he moved to a new address, where his behavior would become increasingly more bizarre. Between 1979 and 1981, civil servant Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men at his flat in Cricklewood. In October of '81, he moved to a rented top-floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, where his disturbed fantasies would take a new twist. 21-year-old Carl Stotter met the seemingly kind and friendly Nilsen at the Black Cap in Camden.
He took me back to his place. He was a nice guy. He didn't have murderer tattooed across his face or anything like that. He was nice. And I slept with him.
What he did was, first of all, attack him from behind with a tie and throttled him.
He killed me. He strangled me.
He thought he was dead, but he wasn't.
And then he drowned me in a bath of water.
While he thought he was dead, he got himself a rum and coke and lit another cigarette and said to himself, oh my God, here we go again, as if this had been done by somebody else.
He described it as being almost in a trance, that he was doing this act without even realizing that he was doing it. And that's fairly typical. Serial murderers will talk about almost waking up and realizing that, oh my gosh, what are they doing?
When he realized the man was alive, He then got extra blankets out. He rubbed his legs to get the blood circulating properly. He put on an extra fire.
Heart massage, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He brought me back to life. I was there for 3 days.
You've got a classic example of Nilsen initially trying to kill, believing he's killed the victim, but then realizing that the young man is actually still alive. And then Nilsen going into Good Samaritan mode, trying to help the young man get better. Nilsen is able to kind of inhabit a kind of parallel universe in which he no longer sees himself as being someone who's doing wrong, but actually can interpret his actions as somebody who's doing good.
He told me that what happened was I got caught up in the sleeping bag set, and that was it. And I believed him, because you don't think that somebody's going to try and kill you. Anyway, he did.
Carl Stotter would not be the only recipient of Nilsen's Good Samaritan Act. At least 3 more young men would be strangled and then allowed to live. The attacks would remain uninvestigated by the police.
Most of the police would say, well, you were in a bondage game and it's your fault, you participated. And the absolute humiliation of saying, oh gosh, I don't want to be known for this kind of behavior really protects the serial murderer.
It appears Nilsen's odd behavior was not only reserved for strangers.
I fell asleep on the floor. I wouldn't get into the bed. I woke up and he was straddled over me. He had what I call an apple knife. But behind him, there was smoke, and there was a gas heater that used to be on the wall, had apparently fallen off. Now, I couldn't possibly have knocked that off with my feet, and it was quite bad. The room was full of smoke, and I said, what's the knife for? He said he was trying to cut it, trying to get it right off the wall in case there was an explosion. And I'm positive that when I went to sleep, that gas fire wouldn't have been on, because he was already asleep, and because it was quite a very mild night. That's all I remember thinking, but then again, thought no more of it. I have to believe that he was going to do something. He was trying to asphyxiate me.
But not everyone would escape with their lives.
With every serial murderer, although they start out slowly, they then become more frenetic and they will start killing a lot more people, a lot more close in time.
The addiction becomes so overwhelming that it's the corpses pile upon one another.
At Cranley Gardens, 3 men would suffer the same fate as the 12 at Melrose Avenue. But unlike his previous residence, Nilsen's top-floor flat had no space under the floorboards.
He would boil their skulls to get all the flesh off, and then he would chop them up into little bits. To him, the people were just about the same and equivalent to the meat he was chopping up in the army. Had absolutely no reason or meaning emotionally to him. It was just something he did.
Half of one was under the bars. Pieces of another were in the wardrobe in black bags.
On the day that I went back there, on the very last day, and he wouldn't let me into the flat, he was in the strangest mood I've ever seen him in. He was completely flustered, and I couldn't understand what was happening. And the dog ran down the stairs, and he said, hold the door, but don't go in. And I thought, charming. I thought, I've known you all this time, you won't let me into your flat. I said, he doesn't trust me, obviously. So he brought the dog back up, and he said to me, you didn't go in. I said, no, I'm just standing here, aren't I? And I couldn't work that out.
Nilsen's desperate efforts at disposal would be his undoing. On the 9th of February, blocked drains would lead to his discovery and arrest.
Scotland Yard launched its biggest murder investigation today after a pathologist confirmed that human remains found in a sewer outlet were parts of 3 bodies.
For some strange reason, the minute they said Muswell Hill, they gave no address, they gave nothing. I seem to know that this is him. It's him. I don't know why I would think that. And then an hour later, I was listening more intently, and then they said in Cranley Gardens, and it was the house. Could you stop it a second? Yeah.
In custody, Nilsen would describe the murder of 15 young men in minute detail.
He saw no reason to get worked up about it. All right, if you've arrested me, so let's get on with it.
Nilsen gave us every bit of information that he could think of. I mean, we interviewed him 16 times over the next few months. Throughout the interviews, Nilsen was totally matter-of-fact, quite cold. There was no remorse, there was no indication of any remorse at all.
In November, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment. Over a 4-year period, he had taken the lives of 15 young men. But was the so-called kindly killer born to kill?
Dennis Nilsen was clearly born with a gene which was flawed and which was bound to cause problems in one way or another, just as some people are born with a gene which makes them prone to anger or to jealousy. Nobody is born with an inevitability about his future. The future is shaped by the experience. It may shape the gene which is flawed, but that is not the same thing as saying that there is evil inherent. So Nilsen could have turned out to be a completely different person, not a stable person. Because of the inherited gene, he would still be flawed, but he need not have become a murderer. The idea that he was born evil is nonsense.
He was brought up in a relatively banal, ordinary circumstances. There were certain elements of his life which were odd or which were difficult for him to overcome. But the circumstances of his childhood and the trials and tribulations of his childhood were not something that were unique to Dennis Nilsen, but were common to many hundreds of thousands of young people. And if Dennis Nilsen was born to kill, so would those hundreds of thousands of young people who had similar circumstances that they had to deal with when they were growing up. So no, I don't believe that Dennis Nilsen was born to kill.
You can be born with a flaw which you've got to keep under control. If you don't keep it under control, it's your fault.
I don't think he was born to kill, but certain circumstances made him that way. Des was a necrophiliac. He was a control freak. I think if he couldn't get what he wanted from a person, like some nights he couldn't with me, then he would, if he wanted it, and he was drunk and he was in the mood for it, and I mean sex, then he would do something to get it, go out of his way to get it. He would, whatever it took.
I think all of these people are to a large degree born to kill. It's a biopsychosocial problem, but biology, in my judgment, has a very large component. We don't know exactly what the specific biology or neurobiological problem is, whether it's genetic, hormonal, chemical, electrical, brain damage, a combination of factors. But there has to be a number of things to go wrong in order for a serial sexual murderer to be created.
Nilsen himself claimed to have wrestled to find a reason for his crimes.
It amazes me that I have no tears for these victims. I have no tears for myself of those bereaved by my actions. Am I a weak person, constantly under pressure, who just couldn't cope with it and escapes to wreak revenge against society through the haze of a bottle of spirits? Or maybe it's because I was just born an evil man. Self-serving crap. For me, this is just specious nonsense, self-serving nonsense to try and justify his behaviour.
He's nothing. He's a liar. He's taken human lives. I feel sorry for his mother. To give birth to such a monster.
In 1991, a series of murders in a hospital in Lincolnshire would shock the world.
A chilling pattern had emerged from the collapse of 13 children, 4 of whom had died.
No one could believe that a nurse could kill 4 defenceless children and attempt to kill 9 others.
There was a general feeling that she was being fitted up, you know, that it couldn't possibly be one of us and it couldn't possibly be her.
One of the problems with killing in a healthcare setting is that as soon as the murder is over, the crime scene itself is sterilized.
She would be known as the Angel of Death, but was Beverly Allitt born to kill?
I believe she is a cold-blooded, calculating killer.
It was March 1991. In the market town of Grantham, 5-month-old Paul Crampton had been suffering from a minor chest infection for some time and was not getting any better. Eventually, his concerned parents thought the safest thing to do would be to take him to the paediatrics ward of Grantham Hospital for a checkup.
He was described by the hospital staff as a happy wheezer, so of course we were concerned. Our child was in hospital, but we weren't worried. We certainly saw this as a precautionary matter, just to deal with this chest infection.
The doctors on Ward 4 decide to keep him in overnight as a precaution. His parents are relieved Paul is now in safe hands, but their calm was short-lived. Within hours, Paul's condition had turned serious.
When I returned to the hospital, I turned into a scene of utter chaos. Paul was laid in the arms of a nurse. He was grey, clammy, cold.
The doctors were called. Paul, whose heart had virtually stopped, was attended by the resus team.
When I came to see the baby, he was shut down, pale, sweaty. So I immediately attempted intravenous line and gave some glucose. He recovered miraculously.
Paul responded well to treatment, and quickly calm was restored to Ward 4, but questions remained.
He had recovered from this hypoglycemic attack, and of course at that point my attention turned to why this had happened and what was the cause.
This was something totally unexpected. It proves that baby had low sugar, but we do not know why a baby has glucose deficiency.
The hospital staff were certainly in a state of confusion and worry, without answers. They could not understand and comprehend what was happening to Paul, but it seemed to me bigger than that, but I didn't understand why at the time.
Little did David know that his son Paul's sudden arrest wasn't the only unexpected incident Ward 4 had seen in previous weeks. In fact, by average standards, Ward 4 was seeing a very bad run of luck when it came to its young patients.
It was over winter time, so you do get an increase in the number of sick children over the winter. It's normal, but it just seemed worse than normal. It was the worst winter that we'd ever had.
7-week-old Liam Taylor was the first to die. Liam had been brought in with a mild chest infection, and within hours of being admitted to Ward 4, had inexplicably collapsed with respiratory failure.
He did have pneumonia, so he was very sick, but he had deteriorated so quickly. The consultant, Dr. Naniakara, was really upset.
He had showed signs of respiratory and cardiorespiratory difficulties, what we call acute collapse, totally unexpected.
And they tried to revive him, but unfortunately they basically said to Joanne and Chris Taylor that it looked like they were going to lose him. And Joanne Taylor and Chris were basically saying that they didn't want him prodding around with tubes and that if it was all going to be futile, they just wanted him to rest. And Liam died in his father's arms.
Just 2 weeks later, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, a severely disabled child, was admitted after fitting at school.
I had asked Beverly if she would admit him and watch over him while I was doing the drug round. I hadn't finished the drug round when she called out that there was a problem.
Timothy had turned blue and was barely breathing. An emergency team attempted resuscitation. But at 6:15 p.m, he was pronounced dead.
Often children who have a disability can have a shorter lifespan because of fits or because they get pneumonia or something like that. So it wasn't totally unheard of, but it was sad all the same.
And again, just 5 days later, another child, 15-month-old Kaylee D, suffered 2 unexplained respiratory arrests. The first was unexpected, but the second bewildered staff. Concerned they had no real answers, doctors transferred Kaylee to the larger Nottingham General Hospital, where miraculously she quickly recovered. So with 4 sudden and largely unexplained incidents happening in close succession, the staff on Ward 4 were growing unsettled.
All of us had our own anxieties, worries. We were very upset.
You try to make sure that what you do is the best you can, and when it doesn't happen, when you have children that die, you find it really hard.
For David and his wife, the panic was over for now, and their 5-month-old son, Paul, was on the mend.
Beverly Allitt, being the nurse on duty, went to take down the drip, and once again the child became cyanosed and the resuscitation team were called to restart the child's heart.
Paul Crampton was successfully revived again, and for 3 days remained happy and content. So stable was Paul, in fact, that doctors felt as though he was safe to return home, and preparations for him to do so began.
I'd gone to the hospital canteen to get some lunch, and when I came back, Paul was having another hypoglycemic attack.
With this third unexplained incident, enough was enough. The doctors were at a loss, and Paul needed help fast. On another glucose drip, he was rushed to the Queen's Medical Centre, a larger hospital 20 miles away, where he quickly recovered.
Now, during that last attack, Dr. Porter took blood from the child, which was sent off to the University of Cardiff for analysis.
To make sure Paul Crampton got to Nottingham safely, a concerned nurse took it upon herself to accompany them in the ambulance.
Nurse Beverly Allitt volunteered to go with my wife and be with her during what was clearly quite a traumatic journey.
On the surface, the inexperienced nurse had had a terribly traumatic beginning to her career. But to everyone's relief, Allitt had remained cool, calm and collected throughout.
Her colleagues certainly felt sorry for Beverly Allitt in the first days because she had been present at several of the attacks.
The truth behind Allitt's composure, though, was far more sinister. Beverly Allitt was born on October the 4th, 1968, in the pretty village of Corby Glen, nestled in the countryside of Lincolnshire.
Corby Glen is a small village, just on the edge, really, of Lincolnshire and Leicestershire. It's a small community where most people know each other. Most people would know each other's business because of the very nature of the place.
She was one of 4 children, In birth order, she was the second oldest.
From a very early age, she was an attention seeker. It was quite plain that she was an attention seeker.
She seemed to be a pudgy kind of girl who wasn't particularly beautiful or striking or talented or gifted in ways that other people used to get attention. So she found that having a hurt arm or a cut or a bandage or a broken arm or something like that got attention.
She would cut herself on glass more often than anybody else. She would be going to hospital more often than anybody else. But generally I think she seemed to be just a normal child growing up in a rural community.
Beverly's childhood really was unremarkable until she failed her 11 plus, and as a consequence she went to the local secondary modern school. Her older sister Donna went to the grammar school in Grantham.
She left school here as a 16-year-old with very little academic qualification, but was befriended by a nurse from Grantham Hospital who lent her the necessary books and equipment to study to join the nursing profession, which she did when she was about 17 or 18 years of age.
It was this chance meeting that changed the course of Allitt's life forever. Whilst on her pre-nursing course, Allitt worked part-time at a local pub, where she met several boyfriends.
Interestingly, the boyfriend's nickname for Beverly Allitt was the Fable, because she kept inventing stories about herself. And it's this sense, this need for Beverly Allitt to draw attention to herself, to be at the center of attention, to have people sympathizing with her, that really is the dominant characteristic of her childhood.
Behind me is the Fighting Cock's pub, where as a teenager she worked behind the bar. And it's where she met her boyfriend at the time, Steve Biggs, who she later went on to beat up quite badly whilst they were engaged to each other.
She humiliated him, she beat him up, she was aggressive.
Allitt's aggression towards one she was supposed to love was a chilling glimpse of the future. Although not known by anyone at the time, Beverly Allitt's unusual behaviour showed a remarkable likeness to the symptoms of a rare medical disorder.
Munchausen syndrome was based on the case of Baron von Munchausen, which was a individual who traveled around the world and was famous for telling tall tales and fantastic stories about all of his exploits.
With Munchausen, the person will try and draw attention to themselves by causing themselves damage, which is what Beverly did. She injected herself, she cut herself, she did all sorts of strange things to herself.
It's technically called today factitious disorder, which is a conscious production of fake symptoms, but based on unconscious motives. And it's generally believed that at least one of the main motivations, but maybe not all of the motivation for this, is they want attention. They want sympathy brought about them because they're so sick and they're constantly ill and constantly in the hospital and this sort of thing.
They're actually known as hospital hobos or hospital hoppers. Some doctor will wise up and say, you know what, there's not really anything wrong with you, and then they have to go on to another one, and then another one, and another one.
No one could have guessed the implications of Allitt's behaviour, and it didn't stop her finding an area of study she felt comfortable with. In September 1988, Allitt was accepted by Grantham and Kesteven District Hospital for training as a state-enrolled nurse.
Well, it's no surprise to have her pick, I'm going to be a nurse. This will get her very close to the hospital staff on a daily basis. So that's no surprise to see her go into the medical system at all.
Mysteriously, as soon as Allitt enrolls, bizarre incidents begin to take place at the medical college dormitories.
Feces were placed in the fridge, feces were put under the cooker, curtains were set on fire. There was a whole host of these sort of incidents.
These were never specifically identified as being the work of Beverly Allitt.
With no culprit coming forward, all of the young students were threatened with being removed from the course unless the incidents stopped.
And while she was always central to them, they could never actually say that it was her that was responsible.
Whilst on the course, Allitt's lies about injuries and illnesses continued to escalate.
She'd injected water into her breasts, so one looked bigger than the other. She'd taken nearly boiling water in a mouth and they're about to take a temperature.
She was off with injuries which were relatively minor. She was off with colds and flu, and it seemed that any excuse would do rather than go into her studies.
Between 1988 and 1990, when her nursing course is going to end, she's going to have had something like 160 sickness days in that period of time.
As a result, although she passed, she only just managed to pass the nursing course.
Having scraped by on her course, Allitt decided she would like to train as a children's nurse.
And she was rejected at this particular time, and the board gave the reasons for her rejection as the fact that she hadn't got enough experience of dealing with sick children.
The rejection was a blow for Allitt, but she manages to find a position on Ward 4 of Grantham Hospital, where she can get the all-important experience.
This is Grantham Hospital. The boarded building that you see on the right was in fact the front entrance of the hospital back in 1991. For whatever reason, that element of it is now closed. Ward 4, which was the children's ward, sits more or less behind this front facade. Was a typical small ward with private rooms for children.
Ward 4 was the paediatrics unit of the small local Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. It had always been a calm place, with a steady stream of kids with the likes of broken legs or grommets, generally nothing serious. Despite staff shortages there, the nurses took pride in their work, and there was a host of cartoon characters adorning the ward.
There's chronic understaffing at Grantham and Kesteven General Hospital, and therefore they need state-enrolled nurses on Ward 4, and even though Beverly Allitt has never really had an appropriate health screening or gone through a CRB check, because the ward is so short of qualified nurses, Beverly Allitt is given a job on Ward 4 nursing children.
She was appointed as part of the drive to recruit more nurses. My only regret or sadness is the fact that she was not a children's nurse. She was an enrolled nurse, which is a nurse who has only done 2 years of training, and not a children's nurse who has done at least 3 years of training. But to be truthful, at the time, we were glad of the extra hands.
On February the 18th, 1991, Beverly Allitt began her 6-month contract as a nurse at Grantham Hospital.
She seemed quite keen to learn and eager to please.
It seemed that she started just at the right time, as things on the ward suddenly got much busier than usual, with a number of unexpected hypoglycemic attacks ending in the tragic death of 2 young children. The more experienced nurses on the ward had never known it to be so busy.
I remember we thought of all different things it could be. Maybe there was this new bug that was going around that nobody had found yet, or maybe it was just a bad time for us. It does happen. You do have children who are very sick and they do die sometimes.
The last thing anyone expected was that the killer was one of them, someone employed to protect children.
We work on trust. The day we lose our trust, the whole system will collapse.
Over the next 2 weeks, the situation on the ward continues to deteriorate, as another 5 children suffer a total of 7 collapses, one resulting in the death of 9-week-old Becky Phillips.
She'd come in with a tummy upset. She was only brought into the hospital because she'd been a premature baby. Family were a bit concerned. They brought her in. She was examined. She was about ready to go out. She'd got over her diarrhoea and vomiting. She was put in the care of Nurse Allitt. And then she got home. She became grizzly and uncomfortable and clammy. She collapsed. She was brought in and she died.
And Becky wasn't the Phillips' only child to suffer at the hands of Nurse Allitt. Worried that her twin sister Katie may be suffering from a similar illness, her parents brought her in as a matter of precaution. She inexplicably stopped breathing twice and was resuscitated, but sadly suffered permanent brain damage.
Beverly was regarded as an angel. She had actually found the problem, called the medical advice and got the Katie treated.
Allitt was at the centre of attention again, miraculously always the first to the scene, giving parents the impression she was always going the extra mile.
Her parents think so highly of Allitt that they ask Allitt to become Katie Phillips's godmother.
The young Nurse Allitt was an angel. She had been there for both Becky and Katie and was always on hand to help with the tragic cases that Ward 4 was experiencing. However, when revealed, the truth behind the mysterious deaths would shock the world. Ward 4, the paediatric unit at Grantham Hospital, had had a string of young patients experiencing unusual attacks. One of these was 5-month-old Paul Crampton. On the 12th of April, 16 days after it had been sent for analysis, Paul Crampton's blood was finally tested, and the result was not good news.
The examining scientist had discovered 500 milliunits per litre of insulin in the blood, which is completely unusual because in a child it should be in the region of 10 to 15 milliunits per litre. Since the child had recovered spontaneously, they concluded that either it was a rogue sample or that the child had suffered from an insulinoma, a malfunction of the pancreas which had now righted itself. So no action was taken in respect of that.
A child is in a hospital because they're sick, and so the fact that they would die is not completely unheard of. I mean, people do die in hospitals.
I didn't think that there was anything happening that was caused by a person. It is unthinkable that somebody who is looking after sick children would hurt them. It was unthinkable then. It's unthinkable now.
Over the following 2 weeks, another 10 children collapse, and horrifically, there is yet one more death. On April the 22nd, 15-month-old asthmatic Claire Peck was brought into Ward 4 with a severe attack.
Claire Peck was an absolutely beautiful little girl who had been a regular on our ward. She'd come back several times with asthma, and she would come and have some treatment and get better and go home.
The doctor went off to talk to the family, to reassure the family. Whilst he'd gone, the little girl is left alone with Beverly Allitt in the treatment room. She raises the alarm almost immediately and says that this little girl has stopped breathing. The resus team are called, they get the little girl breathing again, and she seems to be on the road to recovery. Doctor goes off to once again speak to the family, and once again within the space of about 90 seconds the alarm is raised by Beverly Allitt. The child has stopped breathing. Despite the efforts of the resuscitation team, they couldn't get the child breathing again, and sadly she died.
The day Claire Peck died, I think, was probably the worst day we had. We couldn't believe it. And we couldn't believe she was gone.
We all started getting upset, waiting for someone to come out with some magic answers.
With doctors running out of medical explanations, there seems only one possible conclusion. The killer is closer than they dare imagine. Hospital authorities contact the police.
So on the 30th of April of 1991, I, as Detective Superintendent, get a telephone call to suggest that there may be something untoward happening at Grantham Hospital. The initial meeting at Grantham Hospital took place on Friday the 3rd of May 1991 and was attended by a variety of people, but it included the two consultant paediatricians from Grantham, Dr. Nanyakara and Dr. Porter, and the expert Professor David Hull.
Professor David Hull is asked to produce an independent report. Based on just the medical notes of 14 cases, he concludes that only 3 signal some worry, and only one of these, that of Paul Crampton, seriously concerns him, with the notes showing evidence of an untoward act.
In some police circles, there was the suggestion that we were just wasting money and that we should pull the plug on it. But I chose to go down the route of investigating the circumstances surrounding the collapses, the 3 collapses of Paul Crampton.
Following his detective's instinct, Stuart Clifton senses something is not right and pursues the case.
Stuart Clifton, who was my boss at the time, called a meeting one day in May 1991, and he basically said, I have picked you as a group because of the sensitivity or the potential sensitivity of the case. I don't know what we've got. I want you to go up to the hospital in pairs. I want you to speak to the parents of some of the children, some of the nurses and that, and basically, as I've said, do a fishing expedition and just see what you can find out, really.
The police cautiously began interviewing staff at the hospital. However, as they spoke to more parents and employees, things did not become any clearer.
When we first went to Ward 4 to speak to the nurses and that, it was apparent that not only did the nurses not know themselves what was going on, the parents didn't either. And everybody was sort of just wanting an answer to what was going on. And everybody, quite honestly, was hoping that, you know, that these arrests and that were going to be a natural cause.
Among others, they questioned one nurse who appeared to have been present at nearly all of the incidents, Nurse Beverley Allitt.
On the first time that I met her, the 7th of May, Bev came into the side room. She was a quite large, heavily built girl, quiet, pleasant, sat down, spoke, answered all questions really. She was certainly no different to any of the other nurses that I'd spoken to.
Allitt had already spent her entire life lying to people, and this interview was to be no different. The truth would remain hidden for now.
But in the meantime, Stuart, obviously running the inquiry, was looking at different angles and that, and he was contacting various paediatric professors and that to have a look at the files of the children involved. And of course from that, then a different story was emerging.
Outside the hospital, Detective Neil Jones was given the task of looking for any other evidence around the 13 children.
I was over at the Queen's Medical Centre and they sent me to the hospital, City Hospital at Nottingham. And I found a big freezer over there and it contained blood samples. And these blood samples were taken for children in the hospital to check for genetic defects, growth analysis, that type of thing. And they were supposed to be destroyed every 3 to 6 months. She didn't clear the fridge very well. So we got in this freezer and we recovered 9 blood samples out of the 13 children that had been attacked.
These samples were sent away to Professor Vincent Marks at the University of Surrey. And among them was a sample of Paul Crampton's, which was tested for a second time.
What he discovered was quite astounding. He discovered that the blood insulin level was not 500, but it was 47,000, which was the second highest ever recorded in the world. We set about looking why there should be such a discrepancy between Cardiff and the University of Surrey, and discovered that the machine on which it was tested at Cardiff was only calibrated to 500 and it had gone off the scale. In this particular case, he concluded that it was injected insulin. So here for the very first time was some evidence that suggested that there was a killer on the ward at Grantham Hospital.
There was a medical report prior to 1991 about 2 cases where babies were administered insulin and various other drugs, and that is a mother who had actually done that intentionally. Now, that in fact was termed Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
This is when an individual creates false symptoms in somebody else, usually somebody that they're having, that they're in charge of, like their child, for example. And so a mother who's creating false symptoms in their child will put feces, for example, in the baby's formula to give the child a fever. And sometimes in extreme cases, the mother will actually kill the child.
With this revelation in mind, the detectives now needed to ascertain how this could have happened.
We began to look at where the insulin may have come from and discovered that insulin is replaced on the ward from the hospital pharmacy on demand. It's kept on the ward in locked fridges. One key fits any fridge within the hospital. The key to the fridge on the children's ward, Ward 4, went missing. The last person known to have had it was a nurse called Beverly Allitt, who had been asked about it and claimed to have handed it on to another nurse.
Professor Marks tested all of the 13 samples, and it turned out that Paul's blood was not the only one with abnormalities.
Becky Phillips' blood came back, and it got 9,000 units of insulin in it. There was other samples that got potassium, high levels of potassium, and lignocaine, and various drugs were found in these samples. So obviously that galvanised the inquiry, opened the inquiry to look at it in much more depth.
The gathering evidence was now a clear indicator that there may be a criminal on Ward 4, and action would need to be taken as soon as possible.
Stuart had what he calls his old-fashioned gut feelings, and he then decided that he wanted a chart making, sort of defining every child that had been on the ward that had suffered attacks, marking them, and basically seeing if he could establish timelines and who had been looking after the children.
What began to emerge was a pattern that each and every time Beverly Allitt had been left alone with a child, the child collapsed.
I was shocked. I just couldn't believe that she was the nurse who was working with me who actually had been doing it.
The idea that a healthcare professional could actually be responsible for the deaths of people in her charge was a step too far.
She's succeeded in convincing people that she's so caring, why would anyone suspect her?
There was a general feeling that she was being fitted up, you know, that it couldn't possibly be one of us and it couldn't possibly be her.
Beverly Allitt was now the prime suspect. Police needed to act fast to protect the rest of the children on Ward 4 from any further attacks. On the 21st of May 1991 at 7 a.m, the police arrest Beverly Allitt at her home on suspicion of stealing the key from the insulin fridge and for the attempted murder of Paul Crampton.
At no time did she lose a cool, at no time did she give the impression that she was anxious or that she felt that we knew she was guilty of any offence.
Beverly Allitt is taken by Officer Billingsley and Detective Neil Jones to the police station for questioning. Meanwhile, officers search her house.
At the house, officers found a syringe, and in the wardrobe of a bedroom at the house, they found the ward allocation book. We spent hours interviewing her. Again, her reaction was really strange, bearing in mind she'd been arrested on suspicion of murder.
She didn't admit any single offence, but what she did do She distanced herself and she put other people in the frame for each child.
And it became quite clear that there was no evidence that was going to emanate from her.
I'm really sure that she thought in her own mind that there would be insufficient evidence to convict her of murder.
The unusual circumstance of each attack meant that the police did indeed struggle to gather enough evidence to convict her. Allitt was released pending further investigation. And despite the police suspicions, Allitt's cold-blooded ways would not stop. On the 21st of May 1991, the police had arrested Beverly Allitt for attempted murder, but had to release her due to lack of evidence. Her job as a nurse, one of power and trust, made the investigation that much harder.
One of the problems with killing in a healthcare setting is that as soon as the murder is over, the crime scene itself is sterilized. I mean, it occurs in a hospital, they take the victim out, the body, and the cleaning folks come in and deliberately get rid of anything that could be considered forensic evidence.
It was a serious investigation. Nobody expects a carer in a hospital environment to be killing children, and that's what was happening here. But on top of that, it caught the imagination of the world press. And the consequence of that was that it was big news right across the world.
Detectives were called in after 2 months of mysterious deaths and collapses on Ward 4, the children's ward.
One nurse has been arrested and interviewed at the police station under the provisions of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. There may be a need to see that nurse again. Further than that, I would not wish to speculate about any other matters in connection.
With the world now watching, the investigation continues, but the police get an unexpected response from some of the parents.
Their antagonism is to the police as opposed to the person who might be committing these crimes.
One family engaged private investigators to investigate the police because it was felt that the police were trying to stitch up Beverly Allitt.
With Beverly Allitt now the leading suspect, she's placed on leave from her position at Ward 4. Whilst the investigation continues, Allitt moves in with her close friend Tracy Jobson and her family.
The attack stopped as soon as she left the hospital, and the attack started at the home address in Peterborough where she arrived.
There was things like bleach appearing in Jonathan Jobson's bed, and Jonathan was Tracy's brother.
She gave tablets to the dog, and he was rolling about on the floor outside, frothing at the mouth.
Eileen Jobson, Tracy's mother, was becoming increasingly concerned by events in the household.
Eileen kept saying, who's doing these things? Tracy said she had no idea. Jonathan was saying he had no idea. Beverly was saying she had no idea, but then came up with a version of events that she'd seen a poltergeist and that this poltergeist would be responsible for all of these things. There was an incident where they'd gone to Whittlesea Market and Jonathan Jobson, the brother, had complained of feeling ill.
And whilst shopping, Jonathan collapses and he's taken into Peterborough Hospital, and it's later concluded that he'd had a hypoglycemic attack.
And surprise, surprise, Jonathan was made a drink by Beverly Allitt before they left for Whittlesea Market, a blackcurrant juice, which he says tasted funny when he was drinking it.
Eileen Jobson could take it no longer. There was something clearly amiss with Allitt's presence in their home. The police were called, and Allitt was once again taken into custody.
By November 1991, we were in a position to charge Beverly Allitt, and she was charged by Neil Jones with 13 counts, 4 of murder, 8 of attempted murder, and 1 of grievous bodily harm.
Again, Beverly's reaction shocks the police.
Beverly Allitt stood there and made no comment whatsoever, no reaction whatsoever. It was unbelievable.
This doesn't reveal her calmness and her coolness. This actually reveals her underlying mental health problems. She's simply not operating on the same moral level, the same rational level as you and I, and therefore can't comprehend the seriousness of the circumstances that she's in.
She went to her cell, she ate a meal, and she slept overnight.
How could anybody sleep when they'd got such horrendous charges hanging over their head? But her sleep continued and she had to be woken to get ready for court the following morning. I just found it quite astounding.
Over the next 15 months, Beverly Allitt is held at Wakefield Prison, where she awaits trial. On the 15th of February 1993, the trial of the Crown versus Beverly Gale Allitt begins.
A former nurse who's accused of murdering 4 children has gone on trial at Nottingham Crown Court.
Beverly Allitt was brought to Nottingham Crown Court from Rampton Hospital to face a total of 26 charges. Allitt was arrested last May after what the Crown called a chilling pattern had emerged from the collapse of 13 children, 4 of whom had died.
By the time she came to trial, she'd lost an awful lot of weight, and she didn't attend trial for huge chunks of the period of time, claiming that she was ill.
At court, Beverly Allitt pleads not guilty. She doesn't take the stand, and therefore she fits a pattern of a number of serial killers who will be silent in relation to the charges that have been brought against them.
Regardless of Allitt's plea, the prosecution's case was watertight. Allitt was guilty of all charges. She had been the only one in attendance on all occasions children were attacked on Ward 4, and she had been there when Jonathan Jobson fell ill.
The jury convicted her of 13 counts, 4 of murder, 9 of attempted murder, and the judge gave her 13 life sentences.
Everyone was so overcome with emotion, basically, particularly parents that had lost a child. And the police officers, including Stewart and the prosecuting barrister and that, were absolutely overwhelmed and pleased with the result.
The judge summed up the case by describing Beverly Allitt as a very evil lady.
Allitt's constant illnesses and history of fictitious injuries had led the police to what they thought was the motive for her evil attacks and murders. Beverly Allitt committed crimes that shocked the nation. The nurse that had previously seemed to be an angel, in fact turned out to be an angel of death. But what was it that really drove this seemingly good-natured, caring individual to murder innocent children?
When the court case was over and she had been found guilty, which we then knew was true and we accepted was true, then I wanted her to be in prison and to never come out again.
I believe she is a cold-blooded, calculating killer.
Never at any stage did Beverly Allitt express remorse. Even after sentence, when she was seen at Rampton Hospital, not once has she ever expressed any remorse for what she's done.
Undoubtedly, in my mind, she wanted to be the centre of attention in everything she did.
And the fact that 4 children died is almost incidental to the attention that she was seeking.
Beverly Allitt had underlying mental health needs, but that doesn't mean to say that she was born to kill. She would harm children and magically appear at the 11th hour as some form of saviour so as to again draw attention to herself. And that's ultimately why Beverly Allitt killed. She wanted to draw attention to herself.
I think Beverly Allitt was born with a disposition that under certain conditions would bring out violence, would bring out aggression, and those conditions did occur in her life.
But I imagine these things are built up of little bits of a picture, bits of a jigsaw that all sit together to make the bigger picture and produce someone who harms people and indeed killed them in this particular case.
Between the environment and her disposition, that would make her born to kill.
Whatever it was, that's where she finished up, and she finished up committing some horrendous crimes against the innocence of our society, our children.